Now, shortly after The Rise of Skywalker came out, I made a video that basically called the Sith Dagger scene in that film, the one that acts as a sort of map to the Wayfinder device within the ruins of the second Death Star. I called it one of, if not the dumbest things in all of Star Wars, that its existence made no sense whatsoever and left us with so many questions. Like, for example, why would anyone make this dagger in the first place? What was their reasoning behind knowing where one of the two Wayfinder devices is, and then just leaving it, the Wayfinder, on the ruins of the second Death Star, and only making a map to it? I mean, this debris is sitting in the middle of a raging ocean. What if it shifts, or collapses, or falls apart, and the Wayfinder device is lost in the ocean forever? Or what if, I don't know, scavengers show up, and how apparently none have shown up in the past 30 years, how no one has seemingly shown any interest in this place in those 30 years, is pretty incredible when you even just consider the technology that could be gleaned from studying the ruins, or that you could find all kinds of ships and equipment, including working TIE fighters within it, and ones that even have a hyperdrive. And yeah, I get it, it's in an ocean. That's not the most super convenient location for scavengers or whoever else might be interested in it. But no one's come by looking for something valuable in the wreckage all this time? The New Republic has just let it sit there? Luke hasn't been curious about what Palpatine may have had in there? And that's to say nothing of other interesting questions the Rise of Skywalker and the sequel trilogy on the whole left us with. Like, how exactly did Palpatine come back? And what's the deal with Rey's parents? Why did they leave Rey on Jakku of all places, and with Unkar Plutt of all beings, before getting themselves killed by Ochi, the Sith assassin who, used that aforementioned Sith Dagger map thing to do it? But the problem is that, of course, those responsible for making the movies never ever thought about any of this. They never considered or cared about what you could call the logistics behind anything, much less crafting one large coherent story. They didn't ever make a plan for their trilogy, much less work forward from the previous parts of the story to build a bridge between the two that would allow everything to make sense. Instead, they just did things or put things in the story because they thought they would look or sound cool. And sure, a Sith Dagger map in theory sounds cool, I guess. But in all reality, they did these things, put them in there, because they were both convenient and mysterious. Mystery boxes artificially create intrigue without having to do the work, without having to earn it. They're cheap shortcuts that oftentimes don't consider the possible ramifications or conflicts with other parts or previous parts of the story. They simply include things that maybe don't make sense when fully considered or thought about, or that are a good story for another time, or in other words, left for someone else to one day come up with an explanation for. And that day of reckoning of explanations has finally come, or begun, for the sequel trilogy, or should I say it did a couple months ago. It just took me a little while, longer than it usually does with a new Star Wars book, to finally read the book, and even longer to finally make this video. Either way, a newer book called Shadow of the Sith has tried to answer some of these questions that the sequels never concerned itself with, mainly those about the Sith Dagger and Rey's parents, and not so much about how Palpatine actually comes back.
Emperor is dead.
Dark science. Cloning. Secrets only the Sith knew.
And before getting to it, before breaking this book down a bit, let me just say that the book itself, especially when you consider the monumental task in front of it, that being trying to make sense of the sequels, to place them neatly into the larger context, the greater Star Wars story, well, it's a pretty good book. It's an enjoyable read for what it is. That said, there are, however, just like with the sequels it's trying to patch up, plenty of things in it that, well, don't make a whole lot of sense either, or parts of the book where characters must make decisions or act in a certain way that they likely wouldn't, or to overlook things that someone with any intelligence whatsoever simply wouldn't overlook. And so, though yes, this book is still a bit of a mess, it is an enjoyable read for the most part. It is competently written, and I do think the writer, Adam Christopher, does about as well as can be expected given the mess that is the sequels. In fact, I was highly impressed with his ability to take threads from multiple different canon sources, like for example bringing back the Acolytes of the Beyond from the Aftermath trilogy, and to weave these threads together in a way that, for the most part, worked again as well as one could ever reasonably expect and hope for. And as someone who has kept up with virtually everything, if not almost literally everything in the new canon, I very much appreciated his effort. But again, there are still things in his story in this book that, when thought about logically, don't make a ton of sense, like the one for the Sith Dagger being a map to the Wayfinder on the second Death Star, because you see, it is indeed an ancient Sith Dagger, one that has done terrible or horrible things, as Rey says in The Rise of Skywalker when she picks it up.
Horrible things have happened with this.
It was simply turned into a map, the edges of the blade machined to match the edges of the debris of the Death Star and to point to the spot where the Wayfinder is, by the Sith Eternal. And they, the Sith Eternal, are basically the ones hanging out on Exegol and serving Palpatine there. And how they come and go from Exegol without a Wayfinder, well, don't ask me because I'm not sure. Either way, roughly 17 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, and thus 13 years before the sequels kick off and when Rey would be about 6 years old, they seek out Ochi of Bestoon, who we briefly see in that movie in a flashback in The Rise of Skywalker, and he was once a Jedi hunter during the Clone Wars until he ran into Mace Windu, who is the one who took his eyes, or blinded him essentially. Anyway, in the meantime, or since then, he's sort of been an assassin for Palpatine as well as a relic hunter, and the Sith Eternal come to him, again 13 years before the sequels, and give him this dagger, basically telling him it is, or can be, a map to Exegol, where he can be made whole again, where he can get his eyes fixed. But it'll only work, he'll only be able to read the blade if he finds Rey and brings her back with him back to Palpatine on Exegol. And for the record, Ochi has been to Exegol before. He went there with Darth Vader shortly after the events of The Empire Strikes Back in the Vader comic books, where Vader actually saw the construction of the Sith fleet, which, yes, has been going on or being constructed since the events of the original trilogy. Palpatine has been making a Death Star destroyer fleet since then, and don't get me started on all the reasons why that is so stupid. Regardless, yes, Ochi's been to Exegol before, he's seen or felt the power of that place, and so, yeah, he simply wants to go back there to have his eyes healed, he wants to feel whole again, and that is all well and good, that's a fine motivation for him. He's even been studying ancient Sith texts and artifacts and all these things for years to find a way back there. He's become a bit of an expert on the topic, you could say. Which then makes it a bit strange that he can't seem to read the runes or words on the dagger, the ones written in the ancient language of the Sith that appear only after the Sith Eternal cut his hand with the blade, and the blade drinks Ochi's blood. It literally consumes or soaks it up. And more on this dagger and the drinking of the blood and all of that later. Anyway, I say that's strange that he can't read it because, if you'll recall, the language of the Sith was in C-3PO's database of all places, that he just couldn't say it because of an old law made by the Old Republic or whatever it was. Meaning, I find it hard to believe that if Ochi really wanted to, if he was really dedicated enough to what he was doing, which he seemed to be, or it's implied in this book he is, why couldn't he have already found a way to be able to translate or read the language of the Sith, and thus just immediately read the blade? Again, it's in C-3PO's memory bank of all places. Certainly it's in the memory banks of other protocol droids too. Anyway, trying to overlook that, what's even maybe harder to overlook, or what doesn't make any sense, is why did the Sith Eternal locate the Wayfinder on the second Death Star and just leave it there and make a map? Why didn't they take it and put it somewhere much, much safer than the ruins of the Death Star? Again, it's in a raging ocean, anything could happen to it, anybody could drop by. Because yeah, I can get giving Ochi the dagger, I guess, the thing basically curses him and drives him crazy, and doing away with him after he brings them Rey may have been their plan, I suppose. They might not want Ochi to actually make it to Exegol, they just want Rey. But that doesn't explain, or begin to explain, why you leave the Wayfinder like that on the Death Star, especially after Ochi ultimately fails and the dagger goes missing for 13 years, only to be found and translated by Rey and 3PO and Baba Frick eventually. And don't tell me they, the Sith Eternal, somehow figured or knew Ochi would fail and Rey would eventually find the dagger, then find the Wayfinder and make her way to Palpatine on Exegol. Don't tell me they were playing the long game here or some crazy 4D chess. Basically what I'm asking or wondering, and assuming they themselves, the Sith Eternal, remember where the Wayfinder is on the second Death Star, or they made a backup map at the very least, which you think they would, why the heck did they just continue to leave it there for another 13 years after everything with Ochi went wrong? There is no reason for them not to go get it, especially with the dagger that is the map also gone. why did they never go and grab it before someone else potentially did? It's not like it was all that hidden. It was essentially sitting out in the open in what seemed to be a chamber attached to the throne room, which is, I don't know, one of the first places I'd look for something valuable if I were some type of treasure hunter who was searching in the ruins of the Death Star. And again, I feel like this is not so much the fault of the writer of the book, though yeah, I guess he could have come up with something else a little better than this. This is instead just the sheer stupidity of the movie inserting this, not thinking how ridiculous it is to leave the Wayfinder there and to have someone make a map to something that, in theory, would be easily found if anyone at all had shown up. Be that anyone and everyone from random scavengers or treasure hunters looking for a payday to the New Republic wanting to salvage all these raw materials, or, I don't know, maybe guarding and or learning the secrets of a super weapon that can blow up planets. Do you really want that tech falling into random hands? To even Luke Skywalker himself dropping by looking for Jedi or Sith relics, which other parts of the new canon have established he was doing. But anyway, changing gears just a bit, though we will get back to Ochi and the Dagger and all of that soon enough, I promise, we learn that Palpatine's clone name, the one who would go on to father Rey, was Dathan. Which is not a name he was given, but a name that he took from the one person who helped him escape Exegol, where he'd been living during his younger years, kind of left alone or left to roam around freely, because apparently Palpatine protected him or didn't want him killed, because he, or rather an offspring of Dathan's, may yet be some use to him. And so I guess the plan was for him, Dathan, to escape one day so that he would have a child that maybe Palpatine could use, a child they'd have to then track down and kidnap, because they, the Sith, are very much, as mentioned before, trying to track Dathan down and to bring Rey to Palpatine on Exegol. That's again why Ochi was hired. Though why they didn't just treat Dathan better from the very start, why they didn't treat him like royalty and indoctrinate him into the cause, the Sith way, all the while introducing him to some fine women on Exegol that he could father multiple children with. All of that is beyond me. Why they didn't do that is beyond me. It's, again, one of those things that it's very hard to find any kind of logical or reasonable solution to, and thus the book does the best it can. Anyway, as I said, when Dathan is younger, he escapes Exegol on a ship, and do not ask me how that ship got through the barrier around the planet, that you need a Wayfinder device to navigate, and both are currently lost. Don't ask how any ship does that, and it's not like, that they would need crazy amounts of resources and manpower brought in to build a fleet of thousands and thousands of Death Star destroyers, though we do learn that the kyber they need to power the Death Star lasers comes from a mountain of the stuff within Exegol. Either way, after Dathan escapes, he bounces around a bit and eventually meets Miramir, who he falls in love with and who is Rey's mother. And one of the main plot points of the book, pretty much the central one, is Rey's family on the run from the Sith Eternal and Ochi and others trying to capture Rey. And they are kind of helped by Luke and Lando along the way. The family is, They are, you could say, able to help some of the time or in some ways, but always just a step behind or a bit too late to actually truly rescue them and then get to, talk to them about Sith stuff and all. And speaking of Luke, this is probably a good time to talk about him a bit, and the fact that he does speak with his father. He does talk to the Force ghost of Anakin Skywalker very briefly in this book. And this comes after Luke has a vision of Exegol where he's essentially attacked by these dark side wraiths, and Luke has been having visions of Exegol for a while now, for several weeks. He's been feeling a dark disturbance in the Force, and so he eventually goes to Tython and uses the Seeing Stone there, the one that we see Grogu use in The Mandalorian. And there he's able to travel to Exegol spiritually, if not completely physically, perhaps. It's not entirely clear what goes on. And these wraiths, again, attack him, but Anakin's Force Ghost shows up and rescues his son and brings him back to Tython. They then have a very, very brief and cryptic conversation where Anakin lets him know it took almost all of his strength just to save him. And so we can basically only get a few words out, and none of those words happen to be, hey, there's a Sith fleet on Exegol made up of Death Star destroyers, a fleet I saw years ago as Darth Vader, or that, Palpatine's back. Instead, it's more along the lines of, there's darkness afoot, but I and the Force will be with you always, so you're going to be fine, Luke, even though you totally won't be. That then brings us to Lando, who's been looking for his missing daughter for years, who he'll eventually and conveniently find at the end of The Rise of Skywalker. And speaking of convenience, while Lando is out just randomly enjoying some gambling one fine day, he just so happens to be in the exact same establishment in this galaxy of countless planets and such as Ochi is, who he overhears trying to hire some henchmen, and who he hears talking about trying to kidnap a girl for the Sith, which then sends Lando to Luke and sends the two after the girl and her family, and after Ochi and all of that. And as mentioned before, with kind of the help of Luke and Lando, the family does stay one step ahead of Ochi and everyone else that is after them. But they eventually, after narrowly escaping multiple times, Dathan eventually comes up with this plan, or to the conclusion, despite knowing Lando and Luke, a Jedi, are trying to catch up to them and help them. He figures they can't keep putting Rey in danger, that they have to take her somewhere safe while they deal with everything else. And so their plan is to steal Ochi's ship in order to slow down his pursuit, and then to drop Rey off on Jakku with Unkar Plutt because he's a pragmatic businessman, and as long as he gets paid, they think they can trust him. They're then going to try and meet up with Luke and Lando and then go back and get Rey afterwards. And the reason they even know Unkar Plutt in the first place is because they spent time living on Jakku. In fact, they left it, the planet, right before this book starts, because in it we learn that bounty hunters had tracked them there. They had tracked them to Jakku and almost caught them. And thus, it's the last place bounty hunters would look for them again. And though I probably made that sound really, really dumb, and it kind of basically is, it does sound maybe a bit better in the book. It's portrayed or conveyed better in the book, I think. Though, of course, the only reason this is the plan is because, well, we saw in The Force Awakens someone left Rey with Unkar Plutt of all people in the galaxy. And The Rise of Skywalker showed us that the ship that left her there was actually Ochi's ship. And thus, to make sense of all that, her parents have to come up with one of the dumbest plans ever, the one I just kind of outlined a few moments ago. Though, as we already know from the movie, where we see Ochi killing Rey's parents, it doesn't work out so well, go figure. And that's because Ochi, after indeed having his ship stolen by the family, with sort of the help of Lando, he finds out that someone he was working with, I'm not going to go into all of that, but it's General Pryde from The Rise of Skywalker. Anyway, General Pryde, who at this time is High Colonel of some corporate security force but dreams of bringing order to the galaxy, he's put a tracker on Ochi's ship in addition to Ochi's own tracker, which the family finds and removes, and thus Ochi uses the other tracker and catches up with his ship right above Jakku, mere minutes after the family has just dropped off Rey with Unkar Plutt. He then boards their ship, or should I say his own ship, and is so bloodthirsty and kind of losing his mind at this point from the dagger, he's been killing his own men left and right with it, watching it drink their blood and becoming, you could say, enchanted by this thing. Anyway, he's so bloodthirsty at this point, so angry that this random family kind of keeps outsmarting him and staying one step ahead, that he just stabs and kills them without really questioning them at all about where is Rey, though the mother, Miramir, literally says that she's not on Jakku. And since Ochi finds some Aki beads on Miramir's body, ones that she took from Unkar Plutt's shop on Jakku, and these beads come from Pasaana, we see them in The Rise of Skywalker, and that is the planet also seen in The Rise of Skywalker, where Oshi's ship is, and where the body is, and his dagger are eventually found, and all of that. Well, he thinks that that's where they've taken Rey. It must be where they've taken Rey, while again literally being in orbit above Jakku, knowing they just came from there and no doubt able to check the ship's logs or his flight logs to see if they'd ever gone to Pasaana in the first place. And so he of course doesn't waste a single moment on Jakku and instead makes his way for Pasaana. And once there, he's so enthralled by the dagger at this point and can't think straight anymore that he, no joke, he just kind of rides a speeder out in a random direction looking for Rey. He gets caught in a sinking pit and he dies there, which to me felt like the author just kind of surrendering, putting up his hands and saying, I did all I can, I just can't do this anymore. Because it kind of gets worse from here, much worse here at the bitter end of the book. This is where, as talked about at the start, it required intelligent characters to do some really, really dumb things or to overlook obvious things or clues or leads. These characters being Luke and Lando, unfortunately, who more or less finally catch up with the family, but much too late. Because they were able to track Ochi's ship, which Lando knew or saw or kind of helped the family steal. And so they, Luke and Lando, get to Jakku shortly after Ochi has killed Rey's parents and left them in, I think it was some random cargo container floating in space, along with the tracking beacon that Colonel Pryde had put on his ship, on Ochi's ship, which is how they found the container since it was randomly floating in space. And they were actually tracking the ship's hyperdrive. They were tracking Ochi's hyperdrive signature or something. And I'm not going to get into all that. That's kind of its own little subplot. Anyway, they find Rey's parents dead above Jakku, and instead of, investigating Jakku at all, and mind you, they know the initial ship that Rey's parents were on at the start of the book. It's an old beat-up kind of freighter. That ship also came from Jakku, but instead of searching Jakku for clues of any kind, they race to Pasaana, figuring Ochi must have Rey and must have took her there, keeping in mind they can track his ship. And yeah, don't get me wrong, that's kind of fine that they skip on Jakku right away. The problem is they then go to Pasaana and find Ochi's ship abandoned, and eventually kind of come to the conclusion he's out doing something, or that maybe something happened to him and he's dead, and that he didn't actually have Rey after all. Luke even feels through the Force that there's nothing here, that they're wasting their time, even though, well, the Sith dagger that leads to the Wayfinder device that leads to Exegol is still out there in the desert. Anyway, at the end of the day, Luke kind of shrugs his shoulders and says it's time to go back to the temple. He's been neglecting his students for far too long, that the dark side presence he's been feeling for a couple weeks is now gone and everything must be a-okay. And for the record, there's this whole other subplot with an ancient Sith mask that is essentially possessing a former acolyte of the Beyond member, and Luke ends up defeating and killing her and destroying the mask. It is a whole other thing, and if people really want, I could go into a video describing it or covering it. It's pretty interesting, but it doesn't have much to do with the sequels, which is what the point of this video is. Either way, this kind of leads Luke to believe that this was the only real threat out there, even though he knows the Sith Eternal is a thing and they were looking for Rey for some reason. Not that he ever meets or really knows Rey. Whatever the case may be, Luke calls it quits without ever investigating Jakku, and Lando decides to kind of stick around on Pasaana, also ignoring any potential clues at Jakku and declaring they are at a dead end, despite having a huge giant lead that they are both just completely overlooking. Anyway, he's going to stick around to see if Ochi ever comes back for his ship, if he's not actually dead, even though they kind of think he is, and he also wants to search this whole sector again for his daughter. The end. So in closing, as I said, there was more to the book than I laid out here. I was basically covering things that only pertained to the sequels, and a lot of those other parts of the book are actually pretty good. Like I said earlier, the book is well written for the most part, and there's only so much you can do when trying to explain the foundation of a poorly crafted story, the foundation of the sequel trilogy, when those making the sequels never gave their own story any thought, much less any consideration to where the story was going or where it was coming from. That said, unfortunately, yeah, some of the explanations in this book are little to no better. So if you're someone looking for a good patchwork job on the sequels, if you're someone who maybe kind of enjoys them, or at least wants to see them brought into the larger canon in a better way, through stories or a show or whatever it might be, I think you might enjoy the story, you might kind of let a lot of things go, but overall, it is a little disappointing that there are still just huge gaps in the story of the sequels, that it all is not coming together as nicely as maybe you would hope for. But again, I don't know that there's any way to really fix this entirely to have it smoothly fit in with everything else. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. If you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed this sort of breakdown, do let me know in the comments below, and maybe I'll do more like it in the future. Either way, now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Have you read this book? And if so, did you enjoy it? Do you find it to be a good patchwork on the sequels? And do you think the explanations work, or is it just still full of holes? Whatever the case may be, leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.